When the smoke of 1943 settled across the shattered cities of Europe, one thing had become clear to Germany's high command. The war they believed they could win through lightning strikes and intimidation had turned into something far more brutal and unrelenting. The Allies were gaining strength, momentum, and overwhelming industrial power. The skies roared with American bombers every week. Soviet armies pushed west with increasing ferocity. Britain tightened its noose at sea. Inside Berlin, a cold understanding seeped into the halls of the Reich Chancellery, a quiet, unspoken fear that the war was slipping beyond their grasp. And so, in desperation, Hitler and his inner circle began turning toward a single hope: miracle weapons, Wunderwaffe, the technological marvels they believe would revive the dying Reich and terrify the Allies into reconsidering total victory. Germany had always been an engineering powerhouse, but wartime desperation accelerated it into something almost feverish. Laboratories once devoted to aviation and industry became dens of frantic innovation, where engineers worked around the clock under the threat of failure, imprisonment, or worse. In their hands were blueprints that seemed decades ahead of their time: rockets capable of reaching space, aircraft that broke the sound barrier, tanks larger than houses, and guns so enormous that they could destroy cities from miles away. Yet even as these designs promised salvation, Germany was rotting from within, its economy collapsing, its fuel reserves evaporating, its production sabotaged by Allied bombers. Every technological miracle came with a price Germany could increasingly no longer afford. It was in this strange duality, brilliance and collapse, that the first of Germany's terrifying late-war weapons emerged: the V-1 flying bomb, a small, pulse-jet-powered cruise missile that buzzed across the English Channel like a mechanized banshee. The Allies had never seen anything like it. Thousands were launched toward London in 1944, their engines sputtering with an eerie, uneven rhythm that rattled windows long before the explosion. The V-1 was crude, inaccurate, and terrifyingly effective not because of its destructive potential alone, but because it introduced a new kind of psychological warfare. Civilians would hear the distinctive buzz overhead, freezing in dread, and then silence. That silence meant the engine had cut out, and the bomb was descending. The few seconds that followed were filled with terror as people waited to see whether the blast would claim them. Yet even as London trembled, Allied leaders knew something more dangerous was coming. Intelligence reports, decrypted messages, and reconnaissance photos pointed toward a weapon unlike anything yet seen: the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile. It was a sleek, elegant fusion of terror and science that soared into the stratosphere, faster than sound, impossible to intercept. When a V-2 hit, there was no warning. No buzzing, no engine cut, no sirens. One moment's silence, and then the world exploded around you. The Allies found themselves facing a weapon so advanced that it might as well have come from another century. The man behind it, Wernher von Braun, had built a machine that would eventually reach the moon, but in 1944, it was aimed at Europe's heart. But even these rockets, terrifying though they were, paled in comparison to what Germany was building in secret airfields and underground factories. As American bombers filled the skies over the Reich, the Luftwaffe began collapsing. Veteran pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Fuel reserves dried up. The once dominant German Air Force became a shadow. Engineers begged Hermann Göring for permission to deploy their most radical idea: a jet fighter so fast and so deadly that no Allied aircraft could match it: the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. When it finally entered combat, late and in limited numbers, it shocked Allied pilots. The Me-262 moved like lightning, diving into bomber formations with cannons that shredded B-17s in seconds. Pilots watching it streak past described it as a streak of silver fire, a machine that felt invincible. And yet, even the Me-262 was a symbol of Germany's fatal flaw: too little, too late. Hitler delayed its deployment by demanding it be used as a bomber. Factory production lagged. Fuel shortages crippled training. The Luftwaffe was outnumbered 40-1. The jet that could have rewritten the skies arrived only when Germany was already spiraling toward ruin. Just as extraordinary were the weapons built deep underground, where forced laborers carved entire factories beneath mountains to escape Allied bombs. One such labyrinth housed the prototypes for the Horten H-229, a flying-wing jet bomber that looked less like an aircraft and more like a UFO. It was stealthy in shape, difficult to detect on radar, and aerodynamic in a way that predicted the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber nearly 50 years later. Though it never reached mass production, its design terrified Allied intelligence officers after the war, who realized how close Germany had come to pioneering stealth aviation. But Germany's innovation didn't end in the skies. On the battlefield, engineers attempted to counter the Soviet steamroller with monstrous tanks designed to be invincible. Chief among them was the Tiger II, or King Tiger, a massive beast with armor thick enough to shrug off nearly every Allied anti-tank weapon and a gun capable of destroying enemy tanks from more than a mile away. In theory, the Tiger II was the ultimate armored predator. In practice, it was an over-engineered disaster. Slow, unreliable, fuel-hungry, and prone to breaking down long before reaching the battlefield. But when it did appear, its presence was terrifying. Entire units fled at the sight of one. And beyond even the Tiger II was a machine almost mythical in scale, the Maus Super Heavy Tank, a 188-ton steel Leviathan that was so large it could barely move on most roads. It was perhaps the ultimate symbol of Germany's engineering brilliance and its spiraling detachment from reality. The Maus could withstand anything, but it couldn't help win a war Germany was already losing by the day. As 1944 turned into 1945, the Allies had begun to understand a truth they hoped wasn't real. German science had advanced far ahead of the world. What chilled Allied commanders was not just what Germany had built, but what they had been planning. From supersonic research aircraft to intercontinental rockets capable of striking New York City, to advanced submarines designed to operate without surfacing for weeks, to anti-aircraft missiles guided by radar. The Reich was collapsing, but its engineers were racing so far ahead that the Allies had to ask themselves a terrifying question. What if Germany had just 6 more months? The answer to that question forms the heart of this story, because what Germany created in desperation would go on to shape the entire military world of the Cold War. But during the war itself, these weapons arrived too scattered, too late, and too few to turn the tide. Germany's technological fury came at the moment its industrial heart had already been crushed. And yet, for those who saw these weapons up close, for the soldiers who heard the roar of the V-2, for the bomber crews who watched jets flash past like silver ghosts, for the tank commanders frozen in dread at the sight of a Tiger II, the fear they inspired was real. This was not imagination. These were weapons that could have changed everything, if only time had been on Germany's side. As 1944 progressed and the thunder of Allied bombers became a near-daily reality, Germany's weapons program entered a bizarre and desperate phase, a frantic, almost delusional race against time. Factories were burning, rail lines were shattered, and oil was disappearing faster than it could be replaced. Yet German engineers kept designing weapons that demanded more resources, more precision, and more fuel than the Reich could possibly provide. It was as if the High Command believed that one weapon, some final miracle device, might reverse everything, cause the Allies to freeze, to hesitate, to negotiate. And so the laboratories, test fields, and underground workshops turned into feverish hives of innovation, determined to outrun the war itself. Nowhere was this desperation more visible than in the skies. After the appearance of the Me-262, the Allies realized they were facing not just a single advanced aircraft, but an entire wave of radical German jet designs. The Heinkel He-162, known as the Volksjäger, or People's Fighter, emerged from one of the fastest aircraft development programs in history. Designed and built in just 3 months, the He-162 was meant to be a cheap, fast jet that could be flown by barely trained pilots, including, as Hitler imagined, members of the Hitler Youth. It was sleek, fast, and shockingly modern, powered by a single BMW jet engine mounted on top of the fuselage, giving it an appearance unlike anything in the Allied inventory. But the HE-162 also symbolized Germany's collapse. The glue used on its wooden wings was so poor that some aircraft disintegrated in mid-flight. The landing gear bent under weight, and fuel shortages made proper training nearly impossible. Still, Allied pilots who encountered the HE-162 noted its agility and speed, proof that Germany was attempting to unleash a jet-powered swarm that, in another reality, might have overwhelmed the bombers still pounding the fatherland. Even more radical was the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, the only operational rocket-powered fighter in history. It was an aircraft as deadly to its pilots as it was to the enemy, a tiny, tailless dart that blasted off the runway with rocket fuel so volatile that a single droplet on the pilot's flight suit could dissolve him alive. But once airborne, the Me-163 was unmatched, climbing at speeds that left Allied pilots stunned. It would streak straight up through bomber formations, fire its cannons in a fraction of a second, and then glide back to Earth like a hunting hawk. Yet its fuel endurance was painfully short, and its danger was supreme. More Comet pilots died in accidents than in combat, but the mere existence of such an aircraft convinced Allied intelligence that Germany was pushing aviation to limits no one else dared approach. The Allies responded in panic, fearing a mass deployment of rocket fighters, but the Comets never arrived in numbers greater than a few dozen. Like so many German innovations, it was an engineering marvel trapped inside a dying war machine. Meanwhile, beneath the earth, German technicians assembled weapons that seemed more like science fiction than reality. The V-2 rocket, already feared, was only one part of a larger vision. There were designs for the A-9, A-10 intercontinental rocket, theoretically capable of reaching North America. American intelligence pored over captured documents, horrified at the possibility that New York or Washington might have faced ballistic missile attacks had the war continued. This rocket never became fully operational, but its development revealed something that chilled the post-war world. Germany had cracked the foundational technology of intercontinental warfare long before anyone else. And the rockets grew stranger still. Engineers conceptualized the America Bomber project, meant to deliver explosives, or worse, chemical or biological payloads across the Atlantic. They sketched plans for suborbital bombers, high-altitude aircraft with incredible range, and even boosted skipping glide systems that eerily foreshadowed modern hypersonic weapons. Though these projects never materialized beyond paper or prototype, they left an impression on every scientist who examined them after the war. Had Germany been given a few more years, or even a single uninterrupted year, the geopolitical map of the late 20th century might have looked very different. Under the seas, Germany's advances were equally startling. The Third Reich unleashed the Type 21 U-boat, a submarine so advanced that it effectively invented modern undersea warfare. Unlike earlier submarines which spent most of their time on the surface and dove only to escape, the Type 21 was designed to remain underwater almost permanently. With high-capacity batteries, streamlined hull design, and improved sonar, it traveled faster submerged than surfaced. Allied anti-submarine tactics, perfected over 5 years of war, suddenly became obsolete. They knew that if dozens or hundreds of these submarines entered service, the Atlantic supply routes could collapse. But as always, Germany was out of time. Only 2 Type 21 boats ever saw partial use in combat, far too late to influence the war. Inside Germany, the lack of fuel, manpower, and time began squeezing these miracle weapons into absurd directions. Hitler demanded revenge weapons, anything that could strike London, Moscow, or wherever the Allies were advancing. This pressure birthed smaller but still deadly devices, the Ruhrstahl X-4 wire-guided missile, the world's first air-to-air guided weapon, the HS-293, an early anti-ship glide bomb, and the Fritz X, which sank the Italian battleship Roma with terrifying precision. These radio-guided weapons were cutting-edge, so advanced that post-war analysts would trace the lineage of modern smart bombs directly back to German designs. On land, the push for miracle weapons became even more frantic. Germany attempted to develop long-range artillery that could bombard London from the European continent without rockets. The infamous V3 London gun was one such attempt, a monstrous multi-chambered gun that used sequential charges to propel a projectile at incredible speed. But like so many late-war efforts, it was plagued with impracticality and the harsh reality that the Allies controlled the air. And yet, for all the chaos, there were moments when German technology genuinely terrified Allied strategists. When the Allies first encountered the Panther tank, they realized they were no longer fighting the same German army from 1939. The Panther combined sloped armor, a lethal 75mm high-velocity gun, and surprising mobility. It was superior to almost every Allied tank in direct combat. The problem was not the Panther's fighting ability. It was Germany's ability to keep them maintained, fueled, and repaired in a collapsing war economy. The most extreme of all these armored dreams was the Maus Super Heavy tank, an almost unbelievable machine that weighed nearly 200 tons. It was slower than a man jogging. Bridges couldn't support it. Its gun was massive, its armor absurdly thick, but it existed in a fantasy world, a place where Germany had unlimited fuel, time, and metallurgy. In truth, the Maus symbolized the delusion of the late Reich, a belief that sheer scale and intimidation could erase the reality that the war was already lost. Yet, Allied soldiers who encountered German technology firsthand never mocked it. They feared it. When bomber crews saw jet fighters ripping through their formations, when infantrymen stared down the barrel of a Tiger tank, when Londoners heard the V-1's engines sputter out overhead, fear was a constant companion. Allied leaders feared something deeper, the possibility that a single miracle weapon deployed at the right moment might break morale, disrupt strategy, or create chaos behind the lines. The reality was that Germany's industrial base had been crushed before these weapons reached maturity. Allied bombing campaigns, especially against oil production and transportation networks, strangled the Reich. No matter how revolutionary the designs, Germany lacked fuel, factories, and trained personnel. The most advanced weapons on Earth were being built in underground caves by exhausted prisoners, rushed to incomplete assembly, and deployed with almost no testing. And yet, the world would later discover that even in its death throes, Germany had redefined modern warfare. Every major power after 1945 would build on the technologies Germany invented during its final years: ballistic missiles, guided bombs, jet fighters, stealth aircraft concepts, high-speed submarines, advanced tanks, and early cruise missiles. The Cold War would become a playground of German wartime ideas, adopted and upgraded by both East and West. But in 1944 and 1945, all of that was still in the future. What mattered then was survival, Germany's desperate hope that one more weapon, one more breakthrough might turn the tide. As Soviet armies closed in and American forces stormed the western borders, the Reich's engineers continued pushing out weapons so advanced that they often scared even the men creating them. Still missing, however, was something far more important: a coherent strategy. Miracle weapons could not compensate for lost territory, lost fuel, lost soldiers, and lost time. They could terrify, they could inspire panic, they could demonstrate brilliance, but they could not stop the inevitable. The final years of the war would reveal two truths: that Germany had created the most advanced weapons on the planet, and that nearly all of them arrived too late to matter.
The deeper the Allies pushed into German territory, the more frantic the German High Command became, and that desperation bled directly into its weapons program. By early 1944, Berlin no longer had the luxury of careful research, slow testing, or cautious deployment. Instead, the Reich demanded miracles. It demanded weapons that could turn the tide of a war already slipping through its fingers. Laboratories became factories of pressure. Engineers saw their prototypes dragged from testing ranges to battlefields in record time. Projects once labeled too unstable, too dangerous, or simply not ready were suddenly rushed into deployment with orders that left no room for hesitation. And as the tide of war shifted toward the Allies, Germany's weapons began to evolve into a mixture of genius and madness, brilliance and chaos. One of the clearest examples of this rushed desperation was the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, the world's first and only operational rocket-powered interceptor. From a distance, it looked like a miracle machine, a tiny swept-wing craft capable of climbing faster than any aircraft of its time, able to rocket upward at speeds over 950 kilometers per hour, slicing through the sky faster than Allied pilots could even react. British and American pilots reported seeing it streak past their formations like a glowing ember, too fast to track, too fast to chase, too fast to shoot. For a moment, some Allied crews truly thought Germany had discovered a new kind of aircraft technology beyond anything the world had seen. But up close, the Me-163 was a death trap. Its fuel, two hypergolic liquids known as T-Stoff and C-Stoff, was so volatile that simply mixing them incorrectly caused instant explosions, often vaporizing ground crews or pilots. The Comet's takeoff required a detachable two-wheeled dolly that had to separate after liftoff. If it failed, the plane would crash. Landing was done on a skid, with no power and no second chance. And worst of all, the Me-163 had only a few minutes of powered flight before becoming a powerless glider, leaving it vulnerable to Allied fighters who simply waited for it to run out of fuel. Still, the Allies respected and feared the concept behind the Comet. It represented something unsettling, proof that Germany was willing to deploy weapons far ahead of their time, no matter how unstable they were. Yet, if the Comet was a glimpse into futuristic aviation, the Horten 00229 was a full leap forward. Smooth, aerodynamic, with a near-perfect flying wing shape decades ahead of its era, the Horten 00229 looked more like something from the 1980s than the 1940s. It combined two jet engines with a shape designed to reduce drag, increase speed, and even, according to some modern analyses, reduce radar signature. The Allies didn't know it existed during the war. The only prototype ever completed was captured by American troops before it could fly in combat. But when engineers later inspected the design, they realized something chilling. Had it been mass-produced, it would have been almost impossible to catch. Its projected top speed of over 960 kilometers per hour meant it could outrun nearly every Allied interceptor, and its sleek, radar-scattering shape foreshadowed modern stealth technology. It was one of the clearest examples of how far ahead German aircraft design was, yet how hopelessly late these technologies arrived. Meanwhile, on the ground, the Germans were experimenting with a different kind of futuristic weapon, the Schwere Gustav and Dora railway guns. These colossal machines were less like weapons and more like mobile fortresses, gigantic cannons requiring thousands of men and miles of track to operate. Designed to destroy heavily fortified positions, they fired shells the size of small cars, capable of penetrating meters of reinforced concrete. When the Allies first learned of their existence, many dismissed them as exaggerations. Nothing that large could realistically function. And yet they did exist. An engineering marvel so impractical that it felt symbolic of Germany's shift from strategic thinking to brute force spectacle. These weapons terrified intelligence officers. But the truth was more ironic. They arrived at a time when mobility, speed, and flexibility mattered far more than massive firepower. By the time Gustav and Dora were ready, warfare had already outgrown them. Even more unsettling were the weapons that seemed designed not to win battles, but to reshape them entirely. The V3 supergun, for example, was a direct attempt to bombard London continuously from northern France. This monstrous weapon used multiple secondary charges along its barrel to boost projectile speed, a technology now known as multi-charge acceleration. In concept, it was decades ahead of its time. In practice, it was plagued by engineering failures, sabotage, and constant Allied airstrikes. When the Allies overran the site at Mimoyek, they were astonished. The tunnels were enormous, the infrastructure complex, and the ambition terrifying. Had the V3 worked, It would have fired shells into London every few minutes, creating a new chapter of terror bombardment. But again, Germany's greatest enemy was not Allied air power, it was the clock. The war was progressing faster than Germany could build its so-called miracle weapons. But among all the late-war experimental projects, none unnerved Allied intelligence more than the rise of the U-boat Type 21, a submarine so advanced that naval warfare would never be the same again. Unlike earlier submarines, which spent most of their time on the surface and only dove to evade, the Type 21 was designed for true underwater endurance. It was faster submerged than surfaced, an unheard-of breakthrough. Its streamlined hull, advanced battery capacity, and silent running mode made it incredibly difficult to detect. Some Allied commanders feared that a fleet of Type 21 boats could sever the Atlantic supply lines entirely. Thankfully for the Allies, only a handful were completed and fewer still became operational. Rushed training, lack of experienced crews, and relentless Allied bombing on shipyards ensured that the Type 21 arrived just a few months too late to make any strategic difference. But above all, the single project that most symbolized both Germany's brilliance and its desperation was the late-stage jet fighter program, particularly the evolution of the Messerschmitt Me-262. Although deployed earlier than many experimental weapons, the true nightmare scenario for the Allies came close to reality in late 1944. The possibility of Germany mass-producing a refined, fully optimized jet fighter fleet. Engineers had improved the engines, redesigned the airframe, and proposed new variants, two-seat night fighters, heavy interceptors, and improved single-seat versions. Had these models reached large-scale production, the skies over Europe could have shifted dramatically. Allied bombers, which relied heavily on propeller-driven escorts, would have faced near-interceptable jet attacks. The Allies knew this, and they feared it. Their intelligence reports frequently highlighted the urgency of destroying jet facilities, fuel plants, and airfields capable of supporting these aircraft. But Germany's problems were deeper than resources or time. It was running out of experience. Many of the best pilots were already gone. Many engineers had been drafted into combat. The industrial system was collapsing. The Me-262 may have been brilliant as a machine, but machines win nothing without the ecosystem needed to support them: fuel, mechanics, spare parts, trained pilots, and safe airfields. With Allied fighters swarming the skies and Allied bombers attacking factories daily, Germany no longer had the foundation necessary to sustain innovation. As the war pushed into 1945, Germany's late-war weapons became increasingly contradictory. On one hand, the Reich fielded some of the most advanced technology the world had ever seen. On the other, it deployed some of the most desperate, unstable, and impractical ideas ever attempted. Ramjet fighters, vertical takeoff prototypes, remote-controlled demolition vehicles, infrared night fighting scopes, massive hybrid tank projects like the E-Series. The sheer volume of experimentation was staggering. It signaled not confidence, but panic. It revealed a leadership grasping at anything that might change the momentum. Inside Allied intelligence rooms, this created a paradoxical emotional reaction. Analysts were terrified by what they read in captured documents: jet bombers, supersonic projectiles, next-generation submarines. But they were also relieved by the dates, the delays, and the evidence of rushed engineering. Another few months, one British analyst wrote, and the sky itself may have changed. Another American officer famously commented, "We are not winning because their scientists are inferior.
We are winning because their leaders are delusional." The war had turned into a race, technology versus time, and Germany was losing because innovation requires stability. It requires infrastructure, resources, testing, refinement, and a long chain of trained professionals. But Germany in 1944 to 45 had none of those. Every new weapon arrived half complete, rushed, unstable, or limited in deployment. And every time the Allies captured a facility, they found blueprints for more weapons, some extraordinary, some insane, that hinted at a chilling alternative timeline. A timeline where Germany had years instead of months. A timeline the world narrowly escaped. As the Third Reich staggered into its final months, its cities burning and its armies shrinking on every front, its once ambitious weapons programs descended into a strange twilight, half science, half fantasy. The brilliant innovations that had once promised to reshape warfare were now buried under rubble, hidden in mountain tunnels, were left unfinished in abandoned factories. Scientists who had worked feverishly under the pressure of Hitler's dream of technological salvation now found themselves watching everything they built dissolve into chaos. The regime still demanded miracles, but there were no longer enough engineers, materials, or days left to give them. Germany's war machine, once a terrifying symbol of industrial might, had become a patchwork of desperation, held together by fear and dwindling hope. Across the country, production lines that once turned out thousands of aircraft and tanks now struggled to produce even a fraction of that number. Fuel reserves had evaporated, steel was scarce, skilled workers had been drafted into combat, leaving untrained laborers and even children to assemble jet engines and submarines that required extreme precision. Many of the miracle weapons that Hitler hoped would reverse the war never advanced beyond prototype form. Others were deployed, but in such small numbers that they were practically irrelevant strategically, even if they shocked Allied commanders tactically. The V-2 rocket program, for instance, continued its furious pace until the very end. Engineers in the Harz Mountains worked deep underground, racing to build missiles even as Allied bombs shook the ground above them. Some rockets were launched with barely any testing at all, simply because the front was collapsing too quickly to allow delays. But for all the terror they inflicted on London and Antwerp, the V-2s were ultimately a symbol of futility. They were engineering wonders, supersonic, unstoppable once launched, decades ahead of their time, but they were catastrophically expensive and strategically ineffective. Each one cost more to produce than a bomber, yet delivered only a single warhead. They killed civilians, but they didn't slow the Allied advance by a single day. Meanwhile, inside Germany's aviation sector, the situation was even more surreal. Engineers were still drafting new jet designs, tailless bombers, hypersonic research aircraft, advanced night fighters, at a time when there was no fuel to fly the planes already built. Many of these blueprints later stunned Allied engineers after the war. They looked like sketches from the future. But by spring 1945, they were nothing more than drawings on paper, destined to be scooped up by American and Soviet intelligence teams racing toward Berlin. On the front lines, the MiG-26 jet fighter, the aircraft that terrified Allied pilots, was still flying, but in decreasing numbers. Some jets sat on airfields with no fuel. Others broke down, their engines worn out and without replacement parts. Allied fighter bombers constantly prowled the skies, attacking jets before they could even take off. Pilots who managed to get airborne often found that their squadrons had shrunk to a fraction of their former size. The 262 remained steady, capable of slicing through bomber formations with devastating speed, but it was no longer appear in the numbers needed to alter the strategic balance. It was the ultimate symbol of Germany's tragic paradox, a weapon that arrived too early for technological reliability and too late for military effectiveness. At sea, the situation was equally hopeless. The Type 21 submarines, the most advanced undersea vessels ever designed at the time, began appearing at ports, sleek, quiet, and almost futuristic. But the crews had received only minimal training, and the dockyards were constantly hit by Allied bombers. One boat was scuttled by its own crew during sea trials. Another attempted a patrol but returned due to mechanical problems. The few Type 21s that remained intact at the war's end were seized not through combat but through surrender. Allied naval officers who examined them afterwards were stunned. One American admiral allegedly remarked, "This is what all submarines will look like in 10 years." He was wrong. It took less than 5. As Germany collapsed, Allied scientific teams were already moving with military units, carrying lists of names, weapons, and research facilities. Their mission was not only to end the war, but to capture the future. Operation Paperclip in the West and its Soviet equivalents in the East became the largest scientific extraction missions in history. Engineers who had once built weapons for Hitler now faced a choice: surrender their minds to the Allies or risk imprisonment, or worse, under the Soviet NKVD. When American forces entered the Nordhausen-Mittelwerk tunnels where the V-2 rockets were produced, they were horrified. The facility was enormous, built with forced labor, lit by dim lights that flickered across assembly lines of unfinished missiles. Some German engineers surrendered willingly, holding out drawings and prototypes like bargaining chips.